Moduls Rīga un Velve piedāvā.
I have some reasons, but there's no single answer to why people write poetry, because there are many different people and not everyone writes it for the same reasons. What I will say is that there's never been a culture without poetry. So it seems evident that the reason for this is not because there are some strange people like us who like to write it, but because there must be something necessary in poetry for human consciousness. There must be something that poetry gives us. It must carry some information that we can't get elsewhere. Otherwise we'd have cultures without it, but it's always been central to culture everywhere. I believe that there's something in poetry related to death. The idea that we will die is somehow very hard to fathom. Our own mortality is something very strange, and the way we live in bodies and that the body's age is something that is a permanent question for people, and people need to sing out of the body, and the poetry begins an archaic ritual in the song and the dance and the chant, in the trance, and it always has its roots in that very primitive archetypal feelings of what does it mean to be alive. And in all written poetries there is a poetry of celebration, and there's a poetry of lamentation. There's the poetry of joy at what it means to be alive, and there's the lamentation that we have to send people off that we loved onto the other world. And they're the flip side of the same thing to me, which is coming to terms with our mortality. Yes, I think the idea of writing something that will survive you, that will be passed on, that will be useful to other people, is at the core of lyric poetry. That you want to leave something behind, both oral poetry and written poetry. As soon as you have a definition of what constitutes poetry, someone comes along in the history of poetry and says, well, this is poetry too, but it doesn't fit your definition. So if you say poetry is metrical verse, then someone comes and writes free verse that is not metrical but rhythmical. As soon as you say poetry is something in lines, the French poets of the 19th century come and invent something called the prose poem, which is poetry in prose. So I think that I have a sense that there's no intrinsic quality to poetry that differentiates it from prose, but we have a strong intuitive sense and a strong feeling. The borderline is very close, is very thin between some kinds of prose and some kinds of poetry. I mean, there's a very clear line between, say, poetry which moves towards music, towards song on the one hand, and prose, say, newspaper prose. The thing about newspapers, for example, the writing can be quite good, but when you read a story in a newspaper, you read the story and you forget the way in which it was written. But when you read a poem, the way in which it's written is crucial to the meaning of the poem. So poetry is on a kind of continuum or scale, and at one end of the scale is pure lyric, pure song, and that's clearly not prose. That's highly musical, highly rhythmical. And then as the scale moves, you have, say, at the other side, didactic or narrative verse, which tells stories. And when you begin to have stories that in very long lines with narrative poetry, it begins to move over towards prose. It's not prose, but it's like prose. And then you have certain kinds of prose works that move towards becoming like parables. If you think of, say, Kafka or Borges's parables, they come close as prose to being prose poems. Now, poets who write prose poems are very clear that they're not writing stories. And prose writers who write short fictions, short stories, or shorts they call them in the United States, 4-minute fictions, are clear that they're not writing poems. There's a very thin line, you can't always tell. But the short tends to concentrate on plot or character, and the prose poem tends to concentrate on language. So I think of poetry as an event in language, as something that happens, a concentration in language. And occasionally that also takes place in prose. I began writing, well, it's generous to call what I was writing poetry. I began writing out of emotional desperation. I was in high school and I had feelings that I didn't know what to do with, and I just began to write, and I put it down in lines. Now, I'm calling it poetry because it was in lines, but it really wasn't poetry exactly. It was my feelings written down. And that was the first urge, and somehow when I wrote it down, I felt better. I had a grief that I didn't understand, and I couldn't communicate it, and I started to write. Now, when I went to university, I began to read poetry for the first time. I hadn't really read much. I'd read a little, but I began to read poetry, and I began to fall in love with poetry itself, and I began to read poems that really mattered to me. And then I started to try and imitate the poems what I was writing, the poems that I was reading. And I think that from the moment that I started to write a poem like one I had read, I was starting to become a poet. I was turning from a person who was writing poems to trying to be a poet, because for the first time I was trying to make something. Now, the oldest word for poetry in Greek is poiesis, which means making. A poet is a maker and a poem is a made thing. And when I started to try to make something, that's when I started to become a poet rather than a person who was writing down my feelings. I was still trying to write my feelings, I was still trying to express myself, but now I was trying to transform them and turn them into something in language. And slowly, gradually, I became less interested in my own feelings and more interested in the thing I could make, what I could make out of them, what I could turn them into. And thus I began to try to write poetry. It's true that it's extremely difficult to write poems of happiness. Philip Larkin said happiness writes white, meaning it goes blank. But first of all, I'd like you to show me a happy person. I'd like to meet such a person. I don't think there is anyone who's exclusively happy. But what I would say is, there is a great poetry of joy. There is ecstatic poetry. There is poetry of celebration. Whitman is often a poet of celebration and joy. The pleasures of being alive, the catalogs of being alive, is a poetry of celebration. And so you might say that poets who write celebratory poems are, at that moment, happy poets or fulfilled poets. But there isn't such a poetry that's exclusively that way. It's always undergirded by the fact that the things we're celebrating are also passing. They don't necessarily stay. And there's a kind of tinge of melancholy, even in great poetry of joy, that things don't necessarily last. So, but yes, most poets tend to be melancholy, and there is a tremendous poetry of grief and sadness. And I think most people begin writing poetry out of an overabundance of feeling. And sometimes that feeling is grief-stricken and melancholy and sad and lonely. Usually it is. But sometimes it can also be joy. So most poetry, love poetry, for example, is a poetry of lack and desire. But there is a love poetry of attainment, lesser well known perhaps, but there are poems where the poet actually gets the girl, or the girl gets the guy. There just aren't so many of them, but they do exist. There's no requirement for every poet to write a politically conscious poetry. Your job description as a poet is to write the poetry that you can write. On the other hand, if all your poets ignore major events that have happened politically to the culture and the society, then that's a great shame on your poetry. So, say American poets, you wouldn't want all your American poets to write about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. But if 50 years from now, people look back at American poetry and say, no American poet mentioned the fact that America was at war overseas, you'd go, this is something wrong with American poetry. So it seems to me that you need poets who also think about social, political, economic problems. We don't exist just in a lyric state. We exist in relationship to other people too. Now, partly the epic solves this problem, because the epic is a poem of national consciousness. And epics everywhere around the world have been formational in shaping national identities. And then also there are forms like ballads where the speaker is an individual, but is a kind of deputy of a public voice in certain kinds of folk poems. And I think sometimes poets can themselves designate themselves trying to speak on behalf of people who are underserved or people who don't always speak. So I think that it's important for poetry as a whole to address certain social issues. But we saw with the tremendous limitations of socialist realism what happens when governments try to prescribe the way that poets should write. And that seems to me a tremendous evil. I think you let your poets write the way they want to write and address the subjects they need to write. And there will always be a tension in poetry and poets between those who believe that poetry should serve social causes, protest poetry, political poetry, and those who believe that poetry should sing of purer feelings and pure emotions. And I would say again, poetry's on a continuum. And I think we need both kinds of poets, and we need poets who cross the boundaries, lyric poets who also sing of political things, and political poets who also address private matters. I've already seen some poems on Twitter, but I haven't seen good poems yet on Twitter. But you could say that the form of haiku, which is a great form of Japanese poetry, is very short, and it's 17 syllables in one line. And perhaps you could fit a great basho poem on Twitter, but I haven't seen it yet. But poets have written great poems in very short forms. I think the strength of the internet age is that it makes poetry widely disseminated, and that a lot of people can read poems, and there are a lot of sites with poems that send poems around to a tremendous number of people. The disadvantage is the internet does not encourage concentration and attention. It's a constant twittering, it's a constant amount of noise, it's a constant social media. And in America, at least, the whole culture seems to have attention deficit disorder. No one seems to be able to pay attention to anything for long periods of time. The deepest poems require concentration. And it's not that it's not possible to concentrate when you're reading a poem on the internet, but I wouldn't say the internet encourages it. And so I think that the positive side is the wide dissemination. The negative side is we need people to put down their devices and start thinking about what it means to be human. And poetry encourages attention and attentiveness. And the internet, I don't think, encourages that. It encourages browsing. The question of value is the most difficult question in literature. No one can answer this question exactly what makes a great poem exactly. People have tried, and people have tried to set up standards of evaluation, but they always feel like school principals scolding the children when you set up principles of evaluation. What you can say is there are certain poems that have stood the test of time. There are certain poems that have survived, and bad poems don't survive because they just don't speak to people over time, and great poems do. Now, Emily Dickinson said, "How do I know a poem? I know it because it takes the top of my head off." There are certain poems that you recognize on contact that have a tremendous impact on you. And they have a tremendous force, and you feel you're in the presence of something. Now, sometimes you may read that same poem 2 years later and it doesn't have the same impact on you, but sometimes it does. And there's no intrinsic quality in poetry that will make a great poem. That is, there are great poems in metrical verse, and there are great poems that are in free verse. There are great poems that are concrete poems, that are visual shaped on the page, and there are great poems that are pure music. There are great oral poems and there are great written poems. There's no intrinsic quality to poetry. On the other hand, most poetry falls away and is not great and will not survive. And there are things that are passed down over time that seem to speak to people over the centuries, across the decades. This might be one criterion. So, also, writing a bad poem is not like committing a crime.
Isn't?
It's not like committing a crime. I don't think it's like killing someone, for example. It may be unpleasant. You may not want to hear it. You may want to make it stop. But it's not, I don't think it's hurtful. And I don't think bad poems drown out good poems. I think good poems will survive. They make it more difficult maybe because there's so much noise, but I don't think they need to be stamped out. I believe in democracy in terms of the writing of poetry. On the other hand, good poems last, and you want to teach people about poetry so that they can appreciate poetry, so they can learn things more, and they can like better things. The definition of bad poetry is that it will not last. It will die on its own. Now, sometimes you might want to help it because it's so terrible and so sentimental. But over time, history has shown that great poems survive. We have to do our part. I mean, I don't think we can just leave it to generations of posterity to decide. I think we have to stake our values down too. We have to say what we care about and say why, and we have to try to distinguish ourselves. But we can't have too much chutzpah about it. It's clear that sometimes poets are not recognized in their own times, who've been deemed great later, and sometimes reputations change. I mean, John Donne was an English metaphysical poet who was known but was not highly valued for several centuries. And it wasn't really till the 20th century that the English metaphysical poets began to be tremendously valued, and you might say their stock went up. So there's a constant revision of historical reputation in the reading of poetry, and it's always in flux. It's not stable. And at different times, different poets are valued. I think you actually have to be brave. When I'm teaching young poets to write poetry, I often say to them that it takes skill. You have to learn all you can learn about poetry. It takes reading, and it takes learning about the forms and the devices and the genres of poetry, but it also takes emotional courage, because you need to face the worst in yourself. You need to just not always make yourself look good. In fact, trying to make yourself look good is almost always a catastrophe in poetry. You need to convict yourself. You need to face what is darkest in yourself, not only what is brightest. And I think this takes emotional courage. It takes guts. It takes guts first to write it and to shape it into something, and then it takes guts to send it out and to publish it and to read it. They're somewhat different things. The most important thing from my point of view is the courage it takes to write it, to face the worst, to look dark, to look hard at the dark things in yourself and the dark things in your culture and your society, things that you don't want to look at, things that you would prefer were put away. And exposing those things is one of the tasks of poetry. But it's also what makes writing poetry so difficult. So I think it takes courage. And then it takes a different kind of courage to be willing to publish those things and to be willing to read them aloud. I don't think that's quite as important myself. I think the primary, I mean, if you don't want to give poetry readings, you don't have to give poetry readings. No one's requiring you. It's not part of your job. But your job is to write the poems, and that takes some courage and guts. At the root of American poetry, we have two great poets, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson was extremely reclusive, and she didn't publish any poems in her lifetime, or only 3 poems in her lifetime. She never gave poetry readings. She never sent her poems to publications. But she's one of the great American poets. You wouldn't say it was necessary for Emily Dickinson to give poetry readings. The poetry reading itself is related to the oral side of poetry. And there were epic performers of poetry, and there are folk songs, and there's the singing of poetry. And the poetry reading is in that tradition to some extent. But not all lyric poets need to give readings. I happen to like to give readings, and most poets I know like to give readings because they like to hear their poems aloud, and they like to connect to an audience. But when you're writing a certain kind of written poetry, the crucial thing is the relationship that's established with some unknown reader. And you are writing a poem not just for an audience in front of you, but for some future reader, some future listener. If you're a written poet. If you're an oral poet, that's a different story. You need an audience. If you're a Homeric singer, you need to sing. The poem only exists in its performance. And performance poetry only exists in performance. And certain kinds of oral poetry only exist in performance. But certain kinds of written poetry are meant to find a reader, and the reader can be 2 people who don't know each other, separated sometimes by centuries. For that, you don't need a poetry reading. You need some future listener. I mean, Paul Celan, great Holocaust poet, said a poem is a message in a bottle sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere in some time it would wash up on land, on Heartland perhaps. So you're sending your poem out into the stratosphere in the hopes that it will find some future reader. It needs a reader, it needs a listener, but it doesn't necessarily need a podium and an audience right at that moment. The poem uses your body as its medium. One of the odd things about poetry is when I read a poem, I am the body of that poem. It is expressed through me, through my vocal cords, through my voice, when I read someone else's poem. And so poems live through readers and through recitation. And I think that it's very helpful to memorize poems. But it's not absolutely required. You can also be a great reader of poetry and read long poems that you admire without memorizing them. Now, most poets I know, most people I know who love poetry, memorize poems. And sometimes you do it consciously, and sometimes you do it inadvertently, that as you read a poem so many times and you think about it, that you memorize it. And there are poets and there are traditions where memorizing poetry is absolutely crucial. This is something I learned from some Russian poets, where they memorize poems as just part of the poetic tradition. Anna Akhmatova read a poem to her secretary, Alexander Naiman, and he memorized it on the first reading. There are poets who really memorize poems, and I think it's very important to memorize poems. But there are readers with bad memories who are good readers. The nature of written poetry is such that when you read a poem, you don't have me there to explain it to you or necessarily to read it to you. It has to be carried by the language itself. And the language itself has to carry the rhythms. And if you want a poem to be read in a certain way, you need to write that in metrically, rhythmically, by the lineation in a way that the reader will be guided by that. But then you have to leave it to the reader. And if readers read your poems in a way differently than the way you wrote them, Well, that's part of the freedom of reading poetry. I don't think there is a right way myself. I have the way that you intended, but the way that you intend, the thing that you intend and the thing that you actually write are somewhat different. And you become the interpreter of your own poem, but you only become one interpreter, maybe an expert, but not the only expert, because then the poem has to communicate without you there to explain it. And readers will find different things in it, and readers will hear it in different ways. And that's part of the nature of reading poetry. Now, that's not true if you're an oral poet, because then there's only your interpretation and the poem only exists in the performance. So if I'm reciting an epic to you, the only way you know that epic maybe is through my reciting of it, or that poem is through the reciting of it, or you may know it from another performance, and then you can compare. But when you're writing a poem, once I send it in, put it in a book, and you read it when I'm not there, the poem has to carry the message. I mean, written poetry is a kind of communication between people who are not physically present to each other. That is the nature of it. And so the reader can be the poet reading can be very helpful, but it's not absolutely necessary for written poetry. For oral poetry it is, but for written poetry I don't think it is. I have a friend, someone I know who is Chilean, and he went to Pablo Neruda's house. He knocked on the door and he said, would you read my book of poems? And Pablo Neruda says, you can't just come here and ask me to read your poems, but okay, leave it. So come back in a week. He came back in a week. Neruda answered the door, invited him in. He says, well, you've written a good book of poems, but all Chileans can write one book of poems. Will you be able to write another book of poems? And this is the question you're asking me. That is, the first book of poems is your song. It's your quintessential thing you needed to, it's your apprenticeship, it's what you needed to write, your beginning. So a second book is another kind of problem. And I think the second book will tell you, begins to tell you who's going to have a life in poetry and who wrote one book. Because you can't, and then also you can watch the careers of some poets. And some people write a first book and then they just keep repeating everything that they do in their first book for their entire lives. And some people develop. Marina Tsvetaeva has an essay called Poets with History and Poets Without History. And what she means by poets with history is poets who develop over time. And poets without history, she used Pasternak as an example, who in their very first book, they sound a note that's their own note and they go on sounding it. And they don't really develop, but the note is a great note and they continue to sing it. So I would say they're poets with history and poets without history, that there's some poets who write one book and never write another one. There's some poets who write one book, keep writing more books, but they don't develop at all. There's some poets who write one book and then write another one. Another one is good too, but it's exactly like the first one. And they go on singing in this way. And then there are other poets who develop. And I think your goal maybe should be to try to develop. Your goal should be to try and write a second book that's different than your first book. And here, this is where knowing something about poetry really matters. Because to write poetry, your first book can be out of your personal experience, but you can't just write poetry entirely out of the things that have happened to you. You also need to know something about poetry. And in your second book, the resources that are available to you poetically really begin to show. Because you're not going just on your initial fervor, your first feeling, your first outburst. Now you're developing a voice and maturing, and the question is, do you really have anything to say? Do you really have something to sing about as you develop? And what you look for, what you hope for, is a second book that's better than the first book. And then poets are on their way. I think this also depends when you publish your first book, because some poets publish it when they're very young, and so it's just very immature. But increasingly, because it's so difficult to publish, many poets publish their first book much later, and therefore they're pretty developed as pretty developed as poets. I think this depends on the temperament of the person. For me, it was much easier to write when I was younger because I loved everything I wrote. I thought it was so great, even if it was really bad. So it was pretty easy to do that because I just was in love with everything I did, but it was terrible poetry. And as I began to have higher standards, it became more difficult to write because I was trying to cipher out what was good. Now, it's been, as I've gotten older and older, it's become more difficult to write, but I hope that what I write is better. So probably I was happier when I was younger, but I'm a better writer when I'm older. I try. I mean, not in Latvia. Yes, I try to spend some time alone with the page every day. You can't just walk around waiting for inspiration. You could have a long wait. Sometimes you need to work. And so I read poetry every day, and I try to write it at some point every day. I'm not like a novelist. I don't sit down at the same time every day and work for 2 hours. But I try to carve some time every day where I'm alone with my own feelings and with poetry and see if I can make something. Every once in a while you write something that comes out pretty well on the first time. And there is a kind of spontaneity to that that is wonderful, but it usually needs some work. Now, the way I write, I don't recommend because I revise as I go. Now, many poets that I know write a whole draft of a poem and then revise it, and some don't revise at all. And I think you can tell who they are by the quality of the work. But many write a draft and then revise it, but I tend to revise as I go. So I write a line, and then I write another line, then I change the first line, then I add a third line, then I change the first and the second. So it's a very arduous process. But when you're done, you're mostly done because you've revised it so much as you go. Now, the difficulty of writing in this way is you can get blocked at any time and get stopped because you don't have what you like as you go. And when I'm working on a poem that I think is going to work, usually the beginning is quite slow, but the end is quite quick. One of the mysteries of writing poetry, I don't really understand this, is when you're writing well, you can do complicated things fairly easily. And when you're writing poorly, when you're not in the spirit, even the simplest things seem impossible. You can't put 2 sentences together. I don't know why. But when you're in this, when everything is relaxed and the form and the content go together, and you're ready to express what you need to express, and there are no blocks, you can do fairly difficult technical things relatively easily. But when you're not in that spirit, where you're mostly not, it can be very difficult to do even the simplest things. Now again, there are different kinds of poets, and some poets write very easily, and some poets find it extremely arduous. And some poets believe in spontaneity, and some poets believe in arduous labor. I can't say that I can recite the best lines that I wrote in any poem, but I can recite something for you. I can give you the beginning of the first poem that I wrote that I thought was a real poem. The earliest poem in my first book, I would say. The first poem that I felt I could do something that was different and that I had something that was my own. The poem where I discovered my own voice, I would say. And that's a poem called Song. And it begins, "This is a song for the speechless, the dumb, the mute and the motley, the unmourned. This is a song for everyone who cannot hear a song tonight, for everyone who cannot listen. This is a song for the speechless, the dumb, the mute and the motley, the unmourned. This is a song for every car that was stripped down and abandoned, too poor to be towed away, too mute and humble to protest." It goes on like that. It's a lyric of singing for those who can't sing for themselves, who can't listen, who don't even know what a song is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.